When Jungkook drops a shocking truth on Jimmy Fallon during a live interview, the show comes to a screeching halt, unveiling secrets that could change everything. Well, Jimmy, the truth is, it's all been a lie. Jungkook's voice was steady, almost eerily calm, as if the weight of his words had been rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind. The studio lights gleamed off his polished silver rings as he leaned back against the plush midnight blue couch, his eyes fixed on Jimmy Fallon's stunned expression. The crowd's laughter had evaporated, replaced by a brittle silence that hung like fog in the studio. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion across Jungkook's face, every sharp intake of breath from Fallon. Jimmy blinked, momentarily lost. His practiced smile faltered, a crack in the glossy facade of late-night charisma. He straightened his cue cards nervously, his fingers fumbling at the edges as if searching for the familiar rhythm of punchlines and applause. But there was no coming back from this. Not with the weight of those words. A lie, Jimmy echoed, his voice pitched slightly higher than intended. He cleared his throat, searching for the familiar footing of control, but finding none. You mean, what exactly, Jungkook? Jungkook's gaze never wavered, his dark eyes sharp and unyielding. The tours, the awards, the collaborations, all of it, he said quietly. It was orchestrated. From the beginning. His words cut through the silence, leaving jagged edges of disbelief in their wake. The audience murmured, the soft rustle of confusion rippling through the seats. Some laughed nervously, expecting a punchline that never came. Jimmy's eyes darted to the producers behind the glass panel, their frantic gestures a flurry of chaos. Cut to commercial. Switch the angle. Do something. But Fallon ignored them, his instincts as a host overridden by pure human curiosity. Are you saying? You mean it wasn't real? Fallon pressed, leaning forward now, his cue cards forgotten on the desk. His knuckles whitened as he clasped his hands together, the tension pulsing through his fingertips. Jungkook smiled, but it was hollow, a flicker of something darker simmering beneath the surface. Not in the way people think, he replied, his voice softer, almost apologetic. Everything was planned, every single move, and I was just playing my part. Jimmy let out a slow breath, his eyes widening in disbelief. I don't even know what to say, he admitted, his voice cracking at the edges. You're saying the biggest musical acts, the world tours, the sold-out stadiums, it was all fake? Not fake, Jungkook corrected, his eyes flickering with a glint of defiance. Controlled. There's a difference. We were still there. We still sang, we still performed. But it wasn't by choice. Not entirely. The studio was deathly quiet now, save for the soft hum of lights overhead. A woman in the front row clutched her BTS light stick so tightly her knuckles turned white, her mouth agape in shock. Fallon's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his mug, taking a sip to steady himself. The cameras continued rolling, unblinking and unmerciful. But why now? Jimmy finally asked, his voice hushed, as if afraid of shattering the fragile bubble of truth that had settled over them. Why say this, now? Jungkook's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of something raw and unguarded. Because I'm tired of the lies, he replied simply. And because they can't control everything. He glanced subtly toward the camera lens, a brief connection that sent a ripple of electricity through the room. It was almost as if he were speaking not just to Fallon, but to millions beyond that red, blinking light. Jimmy's hands dropped to his desk, palms flat against the polished wood. His eyes darted again to the producers, whose frantic gestures had now escalated into full-blown chaos. The signal to cut to commercial flashed across the monitor. Fallon ignored it. His instincts screamed for him to push further, to dig deeper. And who are they, Jungkook? Fallon asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jungkook hesitated, his jaw clenching as if wrestling with invisible chains. You don't want to know, he replied finally, his voice low and taut with warning. Trust me, Jimmy. You don't want to know. The silence stretched out, brittle and tense. Fallon opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form the words, The screen behind them flickered, static crackling across the digital surface. The lights above dimmed slightly, just enough to send a ripple of unease through the audience. "Wait, what's happening?" Fallon asked, turning to the camera crew, but they were just as bewildered. The screen continued to flicker, lines of code flashing sporadically across the backdrop, encrypted and erratic. Jungkook leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I told you," he murmured under his breath, almost to himself. "They can't control everything." And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the lights surged back to life. The screen flickered back to its usual array of city lights and glittering logos. Fallon blinked, as if emerging from a dream. He opened his mouth to speak, but the producer's voice crackled loudly over the intercom. "We're going to cut to commercial," the voice announced, strained and trembling. "Now." The camera zoomed out, the applause sign flickering desperately. But the audience was silent, too stunned to follow the prompt. Fallon's eyes remained locked on Jungkook, whose expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed straight ahead, unyielding. The screen faded to black, and nothing was the same after that. The screen returned from black, and the studio lights buzzed back to life, flooding the set with blinding white light. The audience stirred, whispering in hushed, frantic tones. Some checked their phones, typing rapidly as news of what just happened began its viral spiral. Others simply stared, wide-eyed and unmoving, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath their feet. Jimmy Fallon sat motionless, his fingers interlaced tightly on the glossy desk. His eyes were fixed on Jungkook, who leaned back against the blue velvet sofa with an unsettling sense of calm. The young idol's gaze remained unyielding, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The producer's voice crackled again through Fallon's earpiece, sharp and frantic. "Jimmy, we need to cut the segment now. Legal's going insane. Just wrap it up and we'll figure this out." Jimmy's eyes flickered to the glass panel, where silhouettes flurried back and forth, cell phones pressed to ears, hands waving frantically. The control room was a hive of panic. But Fallon ignored the voice in his ear. He leaned forward, his hands pressed flat against the desk, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial hush. "Jungkook," he began slowly, the tension simmering just below the surface. "If what you just said is true, and I mean really true, you're not just risking your career, man. You know that, right? You're talking about an entire machine, years of control." Jungkook interrupted smoothly. His eyes were unwavering. "Years of control, manipulation. You think what you see is real? It's all just part of the stage. The real world doesn't exist in the way you think it does, Jimmy." Fallon blinked, leaning back slightly, his hand drifting to his mug as if searching for something familiar to hold on to. "You're saying there's more? More than just the music, the image? Are you talking about mind control? What? Like Illuminati?" He chuckled nervously, glancing towards the audience for approval, but only silence greeted him. Jungkook tilted his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "That's just a name, a story to distract you from what's really going on. You think secret societies are the big secret? They're the decoy." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Do you really want to know, Jimmy? Because if you do, there's no going back." Fallon swallowed hard, the tension between them taut as a wire. His fingers drummed nervously on the surface of the desk. "You can't just drop that bomb and expect me not to ask," he replied, his voice cracking slightly. "You've already started this. If you stop now, it's going to be worse. For you, and probably for me." He forced a shaky laugh, but there was no mirth in it. Jungkook studied him for a moment, eyes dark and unblinking. Finally, he nodded almost imperceptibly. "All right," he said softly. "Then you need to understand that what I'm about to tell you might change everything you think you know. About me, about the industry, about the world." The audience was frozen now, breaths held collectively, as if afraid even a whisper would break the spell. Fallon nodded, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Go on," he urged. "We're listening." Jungkook's fingers traced the edges of the armrest, his gaze distant as if he were peering into another time, another place. It started before I even joined, he began, his voice steady but threaded with something darker. The contracts, the deals, they were never just about music. It was about ownership. Of us, of our image, our lives. We signed away more than just our names, we signed away control. They took it. Who? Fallon asked, his voice hushed. The label? Management? Jungkook shook his head, the shadows of the stage lights casting jagged edges across his face. Bigger. The label is just another layer. A front. What I'm talking about is hidden, deep. Is why every move we make, every step is calculated, controlled. If we deviate, things happen. Fallon leaned in, his hands clasped tightly. What things? Jungkook's eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe, or resignation. Accidents, he replied quietly. Disappearances, public breakdowns. When someone doesn't follow the plan, they vanish. Or worse, they forget. Jimmy's brow furrowed, skepticism threading through his expression. Forget? Like memory loss? That's insane. Jungkook smiled sadly, his eyes locked onto Fallon's. Is it? Or is it just easier to believe it's insane than to face the truth? He paused, his gaze never breaking. How many celebrities have you seen? Just unravel out of nowhere. Public meltdowns, sudden health issues, scandals that come out of thin air. Do you ever wonder, why? Do you really think it's always just stress? His fingers made air quotes, dripping with irony. Fallon's hands were shaking now, though he tried to mask it by clasping them together. He leaned back, eyes flickering nervously to the camera lens, the producers behind the glass screaming for him to shut it down. But Fallon's curiosity had already won out. If what you're saying is real, he began carefully, then why are you telling me this? Why now? Isn't this dangerous for you? Jungkook's gaze darkened, his voice lowering to a whisper that barely cut through the silence. Because I'm tired of pretending, tired of living under someone else's script. And because I'm not alone anymore. A ripple of murmurs fluttered through the audience. Fallon blinked. What do you mean, not alone? Jungkook glanced towards the camera, his gaze sharp and unyielding. There are others, people who've seen behind the curtain. They're tired too. And they're ready. Ready for what? Fallon asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Jungkook leaned forward, his eyes burning with something raw and untamed. For the world to wake up, he replied, voice hardening. They can't control everything forever. The truth is coming out. And when it does, people are going to have to choose. Fallon opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the studio lights flickered once more, the screens behind them glitching out with a cascade of green and blue static. This time, the glitch didn't stop. Fallon glanced around, panic flickering across his face. What the hell is going on? He murmured, looking towards the producers. But they were scrambling, phones pressed to ears, barking orders to cut the feed. But the cameras were still rolling. Jungkook stood slowly, the tension in the room snapping taut. You can't stop it, he said quietly, his voice barely audible but ringing clear through the hush. He looked back at Fallon, his eyes resolute. The truth is out. Now you just have to decide what you're going to do with it. And then the screens behind them went dark. One by one, the lights cut out, casting the studio into shadow. Fallon's microphone crackled with static before falling silent. The audience gasped, a few screams piercing the silence. And then, without warning, the studio was plunged into total darkness. Only Jungkook's voice echoed through the abyss, soft but resolute. This is just the beginning. The lights flickered back on, but Jungkook was gone. His seat was empty, the cushions still slightly indented where he had sat just moments before. Fallon stared at the vacant spot, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with disbelief. The audience erupted into chaos, screams and shouts blending with the frantic calls of producers and security. But Jungkook was nowhere to be found. The cameras were still rolling, capturing the chaos, the disbelief, the beginning of something far larger than any of them could have imagined. The chaos inside Studio 6B was palpable. Screams echoed from the audience, their disbelief cascading into fear. The camera operators were shouting to each other, frantically checking their equipment. Producers waved their arms like frantic conductors, barking orders into dead headsets. Everything had cut to black. No screens, no lights. Even the on-air sign that usually blazed red was dark. Jimmy Fallon stood at his desk, knuckles white against the polished surface. His eyes darted around, searching for Jungkook, for a hint that this was some orchestrated prank, an elaborate joke meant to shock and entertain. But it wasn't. Jungkook had vanished. Completely. "Get me a feed," Fallon shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He looked around, catching the wild eyes of his crew. Is he backstage? Did he just walk off? "Someone get me a camera." No one responded. Instead, technicians scrambled around, pulling cables and slamming buttons. Monitors flashed static before going dead again, as if the entire network had been cut off from its source. In the audience, some people were whispering, some filming with their phones. A girl in the third row clutched her phone tightly, staring down at the dark screen. "There's no service," she whispered to her friend, eyes wide with fear. "I can't post. I can't even send a text." The friend snatched the phone from her hand, trying to restart it. "What do you mean? You can always post." Her voice was shrill, threaded with panic. "Try again." But it wasn't just them. Throughout the audience, murmurs grew louder. Phones wouldn't turn on. Screens were black. One by one, the realization crept over the crowd like a chill wind. They were cut off, completely isolated. Fallon looked to his producer, Mike, who had his headset jammed against his ear, barking into the mic. "What the hell do you mean we lost the feed?" Mike's face was a blotchy red, his hands trembling as he switched frequencies on the console. "How do we lose the entire network? This is NBC, for Christ's sake." But the response in his earpiece was nothing but static. Mike pulled off his headset, flinging it across the room where it cracked against the floor. He slammed his fist on the console, his breath ragged. "I don't know what the hell is going on, Jimmy," he gasped, wiping sweat from his brow. I've never seen anything like this. The servers. Everything's just gone dark." Fallon swallowed hard, his throat dry and scratchy. He looked back at the empty spot on the couch where Jungkook had been sitting just moments ago. His hands were still trembling as he reached for his mug, taking a shaky sip. This is insane," he muttered mostly to himself. "He was right here, right here." Mike's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering back to the empty seat. "You saw it, right?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "He just vanished." Fallon's eyes darted to the producers scrambling in the control room, their shadows flickering against the glass as they fought with dead monitors. I mean, he couldn't have just disappeared, Mike. That's not real." "Yeah," Mike snapped, his voice strained. "Tell that to the damn cameras. We got nothing. Not a trace. Like he just blinked out of existence." Fallon's eyes darted back to the audience, who were still frantically checking their phones, whispering to one another, some even starting to cry. He grabbed the microphone on his desk and flicked the switch, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We're experiencing some technical difficulties." He forced a smile, but it was brittle, cracking at the edges. "I promise we'll be back on the air as soon as we can." A man in the front row shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Is this part of the show? Is this real?" Fallon's eyes darted back to Mike, whose expression was grim. "I don't know," he replied, his voice softer, almost fragile. "I really don't." Suddenly, one of the screens behind the stage flickered to life, static crackling across the surface. Fallon spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. "Did you get the feedback?" he asked, voice trembling. But Mike was already shaking his head. "We didn't touch anything," he whispered, stepping back instinctively. The screen buzzed, lines of distorted text flashing across in rapid succession, unreadable and glitching. Then it paused. A single line of text burned onto the screen, clear and sharp. "Are you awake?" The audience gasped. Some screamed. Fallon's heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to Mike, whose face had gone pale. "What the hell is this?" Fallon whispered. Mike shook his head, his eyes wide. "I don't know. I swear to God, I don't know." Before Fallon could respond, the screen glitched again, the text shifting. "Control has been severed. We are not alone." Fallon staggered back, almost tripping over the edge of his desk. His breathing came fast and shallow, panic clawing at his throat. "Mike, tell me this is a joke. Tell me this is a goddamn joke." Mike didn't answer. His hands were shaking, eyes locked on the screen as the text began to melt away, replaced by something else. A face, blurred and shifting, almost like static in human form. The features were indistinct, eyes that seemed to shift and glow with each pulse of the screen. Then it spoke. A low, metallic rasp that seemed to vibrate through the studio walls. "Do you want to know the truth?" Fallon's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stepped back again, knocking his mug off the desk where it shattered against the floor. The face on the screen shifted, its mouth stretching into something that could have been a smile or a grimace. "We've been waiting for this moment," the voice whispered, crackling with static. "The world is about to change. Jungkook was just the beginning." Who are you?" Fallon stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The face flickered, glitching in and out like a bad signal. "We are the ones they cannot control." The screen went black. Silence swallowed the room whole. Fallon stood motionless, his breath heavy and ragged. Mike stumbled forward, grabbing his arm. "Jimmy, what the hell is going on?" But before Fallon could answer, the lights in the studio shut off entirely. The emergency lights clicked on, bathing everything in a dull red glow. And then the sound came, a low, rhythmic hum, like distant thunder vibrating through the floor. Fallon felt it in his bones, a pulsing energy that made his teeth ache. It grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with its vibration. People in the audience covered their ears, some screaming, others crying. Fallon staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mike, what is that?" Mike's eyes were hollow, his face pale with fear. "I think," he whispered, barely audible over the hum. "I think it's them." Fallon blinked. "Them?" Mike nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the emergency lights. Jungkook said. He wasn't alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the void, heavy and suffocating. Fallon glanced at Mike, whose hands were trembling uncontrollably. The screen behind them flickered back to life, a single line of text burning across the surface. "Are you ready to wake up?" And then the feed cut to black. The emergency lights pulsed with a sickly red glow, casting long shadows across the studio as the last flicker of the screen died out. Silence followed, heavy and unnatural. It clung to every surface, muffling even the shallow breaths of the audience. For a moment no one moved, no one spoke. They were suspended in that fragile space between disbelief and terror. Jimmy Fallon stood motionless, his hands flat against the desk as if anchoring himself to reality. His breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes locked on the black screen where moments before, lines of text had threatened to append everything he thought he knew. He turned slowly to Mike, who stood frozen, headset dangling from his hand, eyes glassy with shock. "What the hell just happened?" Fallon whispered, his voice barely cutting through the silence. Mike swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. I don't know," he stammered. "The whole feed. The whole damn network. I've never seen anything like it. Jimmy, this isn't just our studio. Look." He pointed shakily towards the window where, just beyond the audience's gasps and whispers, New York City stretched out in jagged lines of concrete and glass. But it was dark, pitch black, the glittering lights of Manhattan, the neon pulse of Times Square, even the street lamps. All of it had gone dark. Fallon blinked, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of it. That's impossible, he murmured, his hands gripping the edge of the desk tighter. Even during blackouts, the city never goes completely dark. It is now, Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. From the audience, panicked whispers rose into murmurs, then full-blown shouts. People pulled out their phones, tapping frantically, but the screens remained dark. No signal, no lights. A man in the fourth row stood up, waving his phone desperately. My phone won't turn on. None of them are working. Another woman screamed, clutching her child close. What is going on? Is this an attack? Is this war? Fallon snapped back into himself, grabbing the microphone with trembling hands. His voice cracked through the studio speakers. Please, everyone remain calm, he said, forcing his voice to steady. We are experiencing some sort of technical issue. I'm sure our engineers are working to fix this right now. But his words fell flat, swallowed by the rising panic. People were climbing out of their seats, pressing toward the exits. Fallon watched, helpless, as security guards tried to corral them back, their own faces pale and strained. He turned back to Mike. We have to get control of this. We have to. A loud crack echoed through the studio, freezing everyone in their tracks. It sounded like lightning, sharp and electric, but it came from inside. Fallon spun around, eyes darting across the stage. The sound came again, this time closer, almost like the air itself was ripping apart. Then the screens flickered back to life. Static at first, lines of garbled code streaking across the monitors, flashing symbols and characters too fast to comprehend. Fallon stared, his heart hammering against his ribs. What is that? He whispered. Mike didn't answer. His eyes were wide, mouth slightly open, hands shaking at his sides. The code flashed faster, accelerating until the screens blazed with light, burning white-hot. People in the audience shielded their eyes, stumbling back into their seats. And then, abruptly, the light died out, replaced by a single image. Jungkook, staring directly into the camera. He was somewhere dark, shadows curling around him like living things. His eyes were sharp, unyielding, and filled with something Fallon had never seen before. Determination, fury, and just beneath the surface, fear. Jimmy? Jungkook's voice crackled through the speakers, clear and sharp despite the interference. If you're seeing this, it means they couldn't stop it. It means we're running out of time. Fallon stepped back instinctively, his hands raised as if to shield himself. Jungkook? Where are you? What is happening? His voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. This isn't some kind of stunt, is it? This is real. Jungkook's eyes flickered to something off-camera before returning to the screen. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. This is very real, he said slowly, deliberately. Everything I told you, it's just the beginning. They tried to shut it down. But they can't control everything. Not anymore. Fallon swallowed hard, his mind reeling. Who are they? Who are you talking about? Jungkook hesitated, his jaw clenching visibly. When he spoke again, his voice was edged with steel. You don't really think the music, the movies, the media, you don't think it's all just organic, do you? People rising to fame on talent alone? That's the dream they sell you. That's the narrative. But the truth is, every stage is controlled. Every word is scripted. And if you deviate, his eyes darkened. They erase you. Fallon's breath caught in his throat. Erase? Like make you disappear? Or worse, Jungkook replied. His gaze shifted again, nervous. Look, I don't have much time. They're going to try to cut this signal. But people need to know. We aren't just celebrities. We're assets. Controlled. Manipulated. There's an entire network. Suddenly, the screens flickered, the image distorting. Jungkook's face stretched and pixelated, lines of code flashing violently across his features. His voice garbled, then returned, sharp and urgent. Don't trust the screens. Don't trust the feeds. They're lying to you. Everything is controlled. His face began to blur again, his eyes widening with desperation. Find the others. They're out there, waiting. The screen cut to black. A hum rippled through the studio, vibrating through the floor, up through Fallon's legs. He staggered back, nearly tripping over the edge of his desk. Jungkook! He shouted at the darkened screen. Come back! Where are you? The screen remained dark. A hollow silence settled over the studio, broken only by the scattered sobs of audience members and the frantic whispers of the crew. Fallon turned to Mike, whose hands were gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Mike, Fallon breathed, his voice thin and shaky. What the hell do we do now? Mike swallowed, eyes flickering to the control room where producers were slamming phones down in frustration, barking orders to dead lines. We try to get the feed back, he stammered. We go back live. Pretend it didn't happen. I don't know, Jimmy. I just don't know. Fallon looked back at the audience, their faces pale and wide-eyed, whispering frantically among themselves. He could see their confusion, their fear. He could feel it. We can't just go back, he whispered almost to himself. People saw this. They know. Fallon's heartbeat quickened, his hands clenching into fists. Security? He called out, his voice quivering but resolute. There was no answer. The emergency lights flickered, dimming slightly before surging back to life. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. Fallon glanced nervously at Mike, whose face had gone pale. What is that? Fallon whispered. Mike shook his head, taking a step back. I don't know, but I don't want to find out. Suddenly, the studio doors crashed open, slamming against the walls with a force that sent echoes spiraling through the room. Fallon flinched, his gaze snapping to the entrance. Dark silhouettes moved through the threshold, tall, imposing figures clad in black suits, faces obscured by tinted helmets that gleamed under the emergency lights. The audience gasped, some standing instinctively, others shrinking back in their seats. Fallon stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Hey! He shouted, his voice cracking slightly. Who the hell are you? This is a live studio. You can't just... One of the figures raised a gloved hand, and Fallon's voice died in his throat. The room fell silent again, the tension snapping tight. The figure stepped forward, boots clicking against the polished floor, slow and deliberate. Fallon met his gaze, or tried to, through the dark visor, and felt a chill seep into his bones. There was something wrong. Something not right. Jimmy Fallon. The figure spoke, the voice distorted and metallic, crackling through a speaker embedded in the helmet. You need to come with us. Now. Fallon laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. Excuse me? I'm not going anywhere. Who the hell are you? NSA? FBI? You can't just barge in here. The figure stepped closer, and Fallon instinctively took a step back. This is not a request. The voice growled, low and menacing. You will come with us, or you will be removed. Mike's hand gripped Fallon's arm, fingers like iron. Jimmy, he whispered, his voice shaking. Maybe you should listen to them. Fallon turned sharply, his eyes blazing. Are you kidding me? You want me to just walk away? After what just happened? After everything we just saw? No, I'm not doing that. I'm not just going to. The figure moved faster than Fallon could react, his hand snapping forward to clamp around Fallon's wrist. Fallon cried out, the grip like a vice, squeezing hard enough to make his bones ache. You don't have a choice, the voice rasped. This is bigger than you, bigger than your show. You've seen too much. Fallon struggled, yanking his arm back, but the figure didn't budge. Let go of me, he shouted, panic threading through his voice. You can't just take me. The figure leaned in, his helmet inches from Fallon's face. We already have. Before Fallon could scream, Before he could even react, something sharp jabbed into his neck. A needle, swift and precise. His vision blurred instantly, the studio lights melting into hazy streaks of red. He heard Mike shouting, the audience screaming, footsteps rushing towards him. But it was all distant, like he was underwater. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was Jungkook's face, flickering across the screen, whispering words that cut through the fog like blades. Find the others. They're out there, waiting, and then everything went black. When Fallon woke, the world was still dark, but different. His head throbbed, pulsing with each heartbeat, and his throat was dry, scratchy. He tried to move, but his hands were bound, his wrists locked together with metal cuffs that dug into his skin. He blinked hard, forcing his eyes to adjust to the dim light. He was in a room. Small concrete walls slick with condensation. A single light bulb swaying from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows. A metal door stood at the far end, bolted shut. Fallon sat slumped against a steel chair, his wrists locked behind him, feet shackled to the legs. Panic flared hot and bright in his chest. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Hey, let me out of here. You can't just..." The door creaked open, cutting his words short. Fallon flinched, eyes straining to see through the darkness. Two figures stepped inside, their faces shadowed by the dim light. One stepped forward, and Fallon's heart froze. It was Jungkook. His hair was disheveled, eyes sharp and electric with something raw and unyielding. He walked forward slowly, his gaze locked on Fallon's. "You're awake," he said simply, his voice low and calm. Fallon stared, disbelief crashing over him. "Jungkook. What? Where are we? What's happening?" Jungkook didn't smile, didn't blink. "You're where you need to be," he replied. "They brought you here because you asked too many questions. Because you saw too much." Fallon shook his head, pulling at the restraints. "What are you talking about? Where are we? And who are they?" Jungkook crouched down, his eyes meeting Fallon's. "They're the ones I told you about. The ones who control everything. Media, government, industry, all of it. You pulled the curtain back. And now they want you to disappear." Fallon's eyes widened, fear crawling up his spine. "Disappear? No. No, you have to get me out of here. You have to." "I can't," Jungkook interrupted, his voice hardening. "Not yet. If I did, they'd just find you again. But I can help you understand. I can help you see." Fallon stared at him, breathless. "See what?" Jungkook leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The truth," he replied, "about who really runs this world, and why they're so afraid of people like us." Fallon swallowed hard, his mind spinning. "People like us? What do you mean?" Jungkook smiled then, for the first time, but there was no warmth in it. Only resolve. "People who can wake others up," he said. "People who can break the cycle." Fallon's breath caught. "What cycle?" Jungkook stood, straightening his jacket, his eyes never leaving Fallon's. "The one that keeps you asleep," he replied. "The one that stops you from seeing what's really happening. But that's about to change." He glanced back at the door, nodding to the shadowed figure still lurking there. "Get him ready. It's time he met the others." Fallon's pulse quickened. "Others? What others?" But Jungkook didn't answer. He only smiled again, darker this time. "Welcome to the real world, Jimmy," he said, and then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. The room was silent except for the steady drip of water echoing from somewhere beyond the concrete walls. Fallon's head pounded with every pulse of his heartbeat, the metallic taste of fear lingering on his tongue. He pulled at the restraints, feeling the cold bite of metal against his wrists, but it was no use. He was locked tight, secured to the chair with unyielding precision. Footsteps approached from beyond the thick steel door. Slow, deliberate. Fallon's breath hitched, his body tensing involuntarily. He strained his ears, trying to catch whispers of conversation, but there was nothing. Just the heavy thud of boots on concrete, drawing closer with each step. The door creaked open, spilling harsh fluorescent light into the dim room. Fallon squinted, blinking against the glare as two figures entered. He recognized Jungkook instantly, his sharp eyes cutting through the shadows, but the other figure was unfamiliar. A woman, tall and sharp-featured, dressed in black tactical gear that gleamed under the light. Her eyes were ice blue, almost unnaturally so, and they fixed on Fallon with the kind of intensity that made his skin crawl. Jungkook stepped forward, hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets. His expression was calm, almost detached, but there was a flicker of something else there. Something dark, coiled beneath the surface. "Jimmy," he said evenly. "I trust you're comfortable?" Fallon laughed bitterly, the sound cracking in the hollow space. "Comfortable? I'm chained to a chair in what looks like a Cold War bunker with you and her." He nodded towards the woman, who continued to watch him in silence. "I'm not exactly feeling at home." Jungkook's lips twitched. "I suppose that's fair," he replied. He turned to the woman, who nodded and stepped back into the shadows, her eyes never leaving Fallon. "That's Kira," Jungkook continued. "She's security." "Security?" Fallon scoffed, shaking his head. "For what? This isn't some goddamn spy movie. Jungkook, this is insane." He pulled at the cuffs again, the metal cutting deeper into his wrists. "You have to let me go. I have people out there. People who will be looking for me." Jungkook tilted his head, his expression softening with something like pity. "Jimmy," he said quietly, stepping closer. "No one is looking for you. Not anymore." Fallon's heart skipped a beat. He swallowed hard, shaking his head. That's not true. Mike, the producers, the network, they won't." Jungkook cut him off sharply. His voice was firm, unyielding. "The minute you got pulled from that studio, you were erased, scrubbed from the system. I warned you, remember? I said if you saw too much, if you pushed too hard, they'd make you disappear." He leaned in closer, his eyes dark and unblinking. "Welcome to nowhere, Jimmy. Population. You." Fallon stared at him, his mind scrambling to process the words. "Erased?" he whispered, disbelief thick in his voice. That's not possible." Jungkook glanced back at Kira, who stepped forward and handed him a sleek black tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it to face Fallon. "See for yourself." Fallon squinted at the screen, his eyes scanning the digital news articles, the headlines, the photos. His face was everywhere. Smiling at the desk, laughing with guests, clapping along with musical acts. But something was wrong. His name was gone. In its place were empty captions, blank spaces where his name should have been. His bio on the Tonight Show page read "Page not found." His Wikipedia entry had been scrubbed, replaced with a generic placeholder that simply read, "No record found." What the hell is this? Fallon breathed, his eyes wide with shock. You can't just. "We didn't do this," Jungkook interrupted, his voice hardening. "They did. This is what happens when you see behind the curtain. They make sure you never come back." He straightened, slipping the tablet back to Kira, who returned to her position by the door. "You're off the grid now. Completely." Fallon shook his head, his eyes glassy with disbelief. No, that's impossible. I'm Jimmy Fallon. For Christ's sake. You can't just erase me." Jungkook leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. "I thought the same thing," he said softly. "When it happened to me, when they first tried to correct me." Fallon's eyes snapped back to Jungkook. "Correct? What are you talking about?" Jungkook smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I wasn't supposed to be on that stage," he began, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That night, when I spoke to you, that wasn't in the script. I was supposed to sit down, smile, play along, but I didn't." His eyes darkened, shadows flickering behind his gaze. "I broke the cycle." Fallon swallowed hard. "Cycle? What cycle?" Jungkook stepped forward, his footsteps eerily silent against the concrete floor. "The one that keeps you in line," he replied, his voice sharp. "The one that makes sure you say the right things, wear the right clothes, play the right part. You think celebrities just become famous? That it's just luck and talent? No." He paused, his jaw clenching. "It's control. Everything is controlled. And the ones who try to break free, they disappear." Kira spoke for the first time, her voice smooth and unyielding. "You saw what happened to Jungkook. That was just the beginning. When you went off script, Jimmy, you exposed yourself. And now they're going to make sure you don't come back." Fallon's hands trembled in the cuffs. I didn't go off script," he stammered. I was just asking questions." Jungkook's eyes softened. "That's all it takes," he replied. "One question, one moment of clarity, and they cut you out. They erase you from the world, like you never existed." Fallon stared at him, his mind spinning. "But why? Why do this? Why go to all this trouble to control everything?" Jungkook exchanged a glance with Kira, who nodded silently. He took a deep breath, stepping closer. "Because it's bigger than just you. Or me. It's bigger than entertainment, than media. It's control of perception, of reality itself. If you control what people see, you control what they believe. And if you control what they believe, you control everything." Fallon's breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes locked onto Jungkook's. "And you're fighting this? Is that it?" Jungkook smiled, but it was grim, hard. "We are," he replied, his voice resolute. "There are more of us. People who woke up. People who saw the strings and decided to cut them." He leaned in, his eyes blazing with intensity. "And now, Jimmy, you're one of us." Fallon's mind reeled, his heart hammering in his chest. "One of you?" he repeated, his voice shaking. "What does that even mean? I didn't ask for this." "No one does," Kira said, stepping forward. "But once you see, you can't unsee. That's the price of truth." Fallon swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jungkook straightened, his expression hardening. "Now," he replied, his voice steady. "Now we fight back." The room fell silent, the weight of the words settling like lead in Fallon's stomach. He looked around, his eyes flicking from Jungkook to Kira, then back again. "How?" he asked finally. "How do you fight something like that?" Jungkook smiled, but this time it was different, sharp, unyielding. "We wake people up," he said simply. "One by one. We make them see." Fallon's breath caught in his throat. And me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What do I do?" Jungkook leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "You do what you've always done," he whispered. "You talk, but this time, you tell the truth." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbreakable. Fallon stared at him, his mind spinning with the enormity of it all. "And if they find us?" he whispered. Jungkook straightened, his eyes hardening. "They won't," he replied, his voice unyielding. "Because now, you're one of us, and we don't disappear." The concrete walls seemed to press inward, the air heavy with the weight of secrets and unspoken fear. Jimmy Fallon sat hunched in the metal chair, the cuffs still biting into his wrists, the chill seeping through his skin and settling into his bones. His mind was a tangled mess of disbelief and terror, thoughts spinning wildly as he tried to make sense of everything Jungkook had just revealed. Jungkook stood by the door, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, eyes fixed on the floor as if lost in some distant memory. Kira remained in the shadows, her gaze sharp and unyielding, a silent sentinel whose presence spoke of violence barely restrained. Fallon watched her warily, noting the way her fingers hovered near the handle of the pistol strapped to her thigh, the smooth efficiency of her stance. "So," Fallon began, his voice hoarse and ragged, "let me get this straight. I'm erased, gone, like I never existed." Jungkook's eyes flickered up, sharp and unblinking. "To the world?" "Yes," he replied simply. "You're off the grid now." No digital footprint. No public record. Just gone. Fallon's throat tightened, the gravity of the words settling in. He'd spent his life in front of cameras, his face plastered across screens in millions of homes. And now, nothing. Just like that. How? He asked, shaking his head. How do you just erase someone like that? It doesn't make sense. Kira stepped forward, her voice smooth and controlled. It makes perfect sense, she said coolly. You live in a world where every piece of information is controlled. Data, images, news, everything is curated, filtered, and manipulated. They don't delete you, Jimmy. They overwrite you, replace you with static. Her eyes gleamed with a hard light, like you never mattered in the first place. Fallon swallowed hard, his hands shaking. But I did matter, he stammered, his voice cracking. I mean, people watched me. I was on TV. You were a puppet? Kira snapped, her voice slicing through his words. A marionette dancing to their tune. You think you were making people laugh? Sharing joy? You were pushing their narrative. Whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it. That's why it's so easy to erase you. Because the real you never existed. Jungkook stepped forward, his expression softening. It's hard to hear, he admitted, his voice gentle. I know. I lived it too. But once you wake up, you can't go back. Fallon stared at him, eyes wide with disbelief. And you woke up? He asked, his voice shaking. How? Why? Jungkook hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Kira before he took a deep breath. I saw too much, he replied softly. It started small. Things that didn't add up. Tours that were cancelled for no reason. News that never made sense. People disappearing. People changing. His eyes darkened, shadows pooling in his gaze. I started asking questions. That's when they came for me. But I got out. With help. Kira nodded silently, her eyes glinting with something fierce. Fallon looked between them, disbelief scrawled across his face. Help? From who? Jungkook's eyes locked onto Fallon's. The others, he replied quietly. The ones who woke up. The ones who saw behind the curtain and couldn't go back to sleep. Fallon's mind spun, fragments of conversation snapping into place. He remembered the cryptic messages, the glitches during the show, the whispers on the screen. Find the others. They're out there, waiting. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. And you want me to join you? Jungkook smiled, but it was laced with sadness. You don't have a choice, he replied. You saw what they did. They erased you. To the world, Jimmy Fallon is gone. You're a ghost now. But with us, you can fight back. Fight back, Fallon echoed, his voice trembling. Fight back against what? A bunch of guys in suits? Some shadow organization? What are we talking about here? Jungkook's eyes hardened. We're talking about them, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The ones who control everything. The ones who decide what you see, what you hear, what you believe. Politicians, corporations, celebrities, all of it controlled. Fallon shook his head, disbelief warring with fear. That's conspiracy theory crap, he muttered. That stuff you hear on late-night radio. The Illuminati. The cabal. You're telling me that's real? Jungkook stepped closer, his eyes sharp and unyielding. I'm telling you that everything you think you know is a lie, he replied. Every news story, every headline, every scandal, it's all scripted. It's all designed to keep you asleep. And now, you're awake. Fallon's hands trembled, the cuffs rattling against the metal chair. He looked up at Jungkook, eyes wide and terrified. And if I don't help you? If I don't join you? Kira stepped forward, her voice smooth and unyielding. If you don't help us, she said, her eyes boring into his, you disappear. For real. Not just erased from screens. Erased from existence. Fallon swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. You mean You mean you'd kill me? Jungkook shook his head, his expression grim. We wouldn't, he replied softly. But they would. They're already looking for you. Right now. The only reason you're still alive is because we found you first. He paused, his eyes darkening. You have two choices, Jimmy. Help us, or disappear forever. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Fallon stared at him, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to escape, but his body remained still, paralyzed by the enormity of it all. And if I help you, what happens then? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jungkook glanced back at Kira, who nodded silently. He turned back to Fallon, his eyes blazing with something fierce and unyielding. Then we wake people up, he replied simply. We show them what's really happening. We break the cycle. We make them see. Fallon blinked, the weight of the words settling into his bones. You make it sound so easy, he whispered. Jungkook smiled, but it was grim, edged with something dark. It's not easy, he replied. It's war, and it's already begun. Kira stepped forward, her hands moving swiftly as she unlocked Fallon's cuffs. The metal fell away with a clatter, and Fallon rubbed his wrists, his skin raw and bruised. He looked up at her, eyes wary. So what now? He asked. Kira's eyes glinted with something sharp and unyielding. Now, she replied, her voice smooth and calm. We get you ready. Fallon swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. Ready for what? Jungkook's smile returned, but this time it was sharp, edged with steel. For the truth, he replied, and for the fight that's coming. Fallon looked between them, his mind spinning, his heart pounding. He was terrified, confused, angry, but more than anything, he was awake, and there was no going back. The room they brought Fallon to was unlike anything he had expected. After Kira uncuffed him, she led him and Jungkook through a labyrinth of concrete hallways, each turn guarded by men and women who looked more like ghosts than soldiers. Silent, watchful, their eyes sharp and unyielding. Fallon's mind spun with disbelief, his footsteps heavy as he followed in silence, his thoughts scrambling to catch up with reality. At last, they stopped in front of a heavy steel door, the kind you'd expect to see in a bank vault or a military bunker. Kira punched a code into the keypad beside it, fingers flying across the numbers in a blur of muscle memory, and the locks clicked open with a heavy thud. She swung the door wide, and Fallon stepped inside. The space beyond was vast, sprawling out into what seemed like an underground city. Fluorescent lights hummed from above, casting a pale glow over rows of computers, workstations, and screens. People moved with purpose, typing, strategizing, conversing in hushed voices that carried the weight of urgency. Fallon's eyes widened as he took it all in, his breath catching in his throat. What is this place? He whispered, his voice nearly drowned out by the soft hum of machinery. Jungkook stepped up beside him, his hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets. His eyes scanned the room with something that looked like pride. This, he said, his voice steady, is the grid. Fallon blinked, turning to look at him. The grid? What does that even mean? Kira stepped forward, her boots clicking against the concrete floor. It's where the fight starts, she replied, her tone clipped and efficient. We operate off the grid, away from their eyes, away from their control. She gestured toward the screens that lined the walls, each one flickering with streams of code. Live feeds from security cameras, satellite imagery, and digital maps dotted with red and green lights. We monitor everything, every feed, every signal, every communication. This is where we find the truth, and where we reveal it. Fallon stared, mouth agape. You're spying on everyone? On the government? On all of it? Jungkook smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. We're watching the watchers, he replied. They control the narrative, Jimmy. They decide what you see, what you don't see. We disrupt that. Fallon swallowed hard, his gaze flickering back to the screens. A live feed showed the exterior of NBC studios. Police cars lined up in rows, flashing red and blue lights casting jagged shadows across the pavement. Reporters stood behind barricades, shouting questions to officers who ignored them, their faces grim and unyielding. "Jesus," Fallon whispered, his hands shaking slightly. "They really are looking for me." Jungkook nodded. "And they won't stop," he replied. "To them, you're a liability now. You saw too much. You asked the wrong questions. You woke up. They can't allow that. Not if they want to keep their narrative intact." Fallon turned to face him fully, eyes sharp and desperate. "And you've been fighting this? How long? How many of you are there?" Jungkook exchanged a glance with Kira, who nodded. He turned back to Fallon, his expression hardening. "Longer than you'd believe," he replied. "There are more of us than you think. Artists, politicians, journalists, people who woke up, who saw the cracks in the stories they were fed. People who refused to go back to sleep. And now me," Fallon added, his voice almost a whisper. Jungkook's gaze softened, just for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Now you." Kira cleared her throat, stepping forward. "There's someone you need to meet," she said, her voice low. Fallon looked at her, brows knitting together. "Who?" he asked. Kira's eyes flickered with something like anticipation. "The one who started it all," she replied. "The one who woke us up." Fallon's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Jungkook, who merely nodded. "You're ready," Jungkook said simply. Fallon's mouth went dry, but he nodded, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over him. "Okay," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Okay. Let's do it." Kira turned on her heel, boots echoing against the concrete as she led them through another series of hallways. The walls grew narrower, the lights dimmer, until they reached another heavy door, this one marked with a single emblem. A lion's head, mouth open, eyes blazing. Kira placed her hand against the emblem, pressing down. Fallon heard a hiss of air, the shifting of locks, and the door swung inward with a low groan. She stepped inside, gesturing for Fallon and Jungkook to follow. The room beyond was stark, concrete floors, steel walls, but the air was different. Heavy, charged. Fallon felt it prickle across his skin, raising the hairs on his arms. At the far end of the room stood a figure, tall and lean, with their back to him. They wore a black jacket, hair pulled back into a tight braid that gleamed under the low light. The room buzzed with energy, a living pulse that seemed to vibrate through Fallon's bones. Lana stood before him, arms crossed over her chest, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Behind her, the wall of screens flickered with streams of information. Data points, security feeds, redacted documents scrolling endlessly across the monitors. Jungkook stood silently at her right, his hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on Fallon with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Lana's voice sliced through the silence, smooth and unyielding. "You have questions," she began, her tone making it clear that this was more statement than suggestion. Fallon nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I've got a few." Lana gestured towards a long metal table that stretched across the room. Fallon hadn't noticed it before. Its surface cluttered with maps, diagrams, stacks of files marked with thick red stamps reading classified. "Sit," she commanded, her eyes never leaving his. Fallon hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his footsteps heavy against the concrete floor. He pulled out one of the metal chairs, the legs scraping loudly against the ground, and sat. Lana and Jungkook followed, taking seats across from him. Kira hovered near the door, arms crossed, eyes watchful. Lana leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her gaze locked onto his. "I'm going to explain everything," she began, her voice low and steady. "But first, I need you to understand that everything you thought you knew is a lie." Fallon swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. "I'm starting to figure that out," he replied, his voice edged with bitterness. You said you've been planting seeds. Hints. Warnings. Through the music. Through the media. What does that mean? Lana's eyes flickered with something like satisfaction. It means, she said slowly, that we've been working from the inside, for years, carefully, deliberately. We hide messages in plain sight, lyrics, interviews, subtle glitches in live broadcasts, patterns that only the truly awake can see. Fallon's mind spun, memories flashing before his eyes, music videos that never quite made sense, cryptic interviews that felt scripted, glitches during live shows that were brushed off as technical errors. That's impossible, he whispered. People would notice. They'd call it out. Jungkook leaned forward, his voice low and steady. They do, he said. But when they try, they get silenced. Or worse, you've seen it. Celebrities who suddenly vanish, who have nervous breakdowns or end up in accidents. That's not a coincidence. It's control. Fallon shook his head, disbelief warring with something darker. Something sharp and jagged clawing its way up from his gut. But why? He demanded, his voice cracking. Why control all of this? What's the point? Lana leaned back, her gaze never wavering. The point, she said, her voice dripping with conviction, is obedience. You can't control a society that thinks for itself. But if you control what they see, what they hear, you control how they think. And if you control how they think, you control everything. Her words slammed into him, heavy and unrelenting. Fallon looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if trying to feel his own reality. I don't understand, he murmured. How does this even work? How do you control the whole world? Lana exchanged a glance with Jungkook, who nodded. She turned back to Fallon, her expression hardening. The grid, she replied. It's the backbone of everything. A neural network that monitors every digital interaction. Texts, emails, social media, broadcasts. All of it flows through the grid, and all of it is filtered, controlled, and altered. Fallon's eyes went wide. You mean everything? Everything is fake. Lana's smile was sharp, predatory. Not fake, she corrected. Directed. Manipulated. They decide what you see and what you don't. They decide who rises and who falls. And if you step out of line, you disappear. Fallon's breath came fast and shallow, his hands trembling. But that's impossible. There are too many people. Too many variables. How could you possibly control it all? Jungkook leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Because they've been doing it for centuries, he said. Long before television. Long before radio. It's always been about controlling the message. Kings did it with town criers. Empires did it with scrolls. The only difference now is the technology. Fallon's mind raced. Every belief he had ever held crumbling beneath the weight of the revelation. He looked up, his eyes meeting Lana's. And you're fighting this? Her gaze softened just a fraction. We're trying, she replied. For years we've been chipping away at their control. Small things. Broadcast glitches. Celebrity slip-ups. You think Britney's meltdown was random? You think Kanye's outbursts were just episodes? She leaned forward, eyes blazing. They woke up. They saw the truth. And they were punished for it. Fallon's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. And me? What happens to me? Lana exchanged a glance with Jungkook. That depends, she said, her voice softening, on what you do next. Fallon's breath caught. What I do next? He repeated, voice cracking. What the hell am I supposed to do? I'm just a talk show host. I don't know how to fight something like this. Jungkook placed a hand on the table, his expression fierce. You're not just a talk show host, he replied, his voice steady. You're a voice, a loud one. Millions of people listen to you every night. You can wake them up. Lana nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We want you to go back," she said, "to the show. But this time, you don't follow the script. This time, you tell them what's really happening." Fallon stared at her, his mind reeling. "You want me to just say it? On live TV? That everything's a lie? That the world is controlled by some secret network?" He laughed, the sound cracking with disbelief. "I'd be shot before I made it to the second commercial break." Jungkook's gaze hardened. "We can protect you," he replied firmly. "The grid is their weapon, but we've learned to break it. Just enough to get you on the air. Long enough for you to speak the truth." Lana leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You can shatter the illusion, Jimmy," she said. "You can show them what's really happening. You can wake them up." Fallon's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with images of what that would mean. The risk, the chaos, the truth. He looked around the room, at the screens flickering with the faces of those who still slumbered, blind to the strings that bound them. He looked back at Lana, her eyes blazing with conviction. "And if I say yes?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What happens then?" Lana's smile returned, sharper than before. "Then we go to war," she replied simply. "And this time, we win." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like dust in the still air. Fallon swallowed hard, his hands shaking. He looked at Jungkook, whose eyes burned with unyielding resolve, and back at Lana, whose smile was a promise of revolution. For the first time in his life, Fallon felt something crack open inside him. Something raw and defiant, something that whispered of freedom and fire. He took a deep breath, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Then let's wake them up," he said. "All of them." The room hummed with anticipation. Cables snaked across the concrete floor. Monitors flickered with streams of code and live feeds from major news outlets. And the sharp staccato of keyboards filled the space with a sense of urgency. Fallon stood in the center of it all, his eyes scanning the controlled chaos around him. Kira was barking orders into a headset, her voice clipped and efficient, while Lana pored over a series of maps laid out across a metal table, lines of red and blue crisscrossing like veins on a beating heart. Jungkook stood beside him, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes never leaving the largest screen that dominated the far wall. It showed a live feed of the Tonight Show stage, his stage. Fallon stared at it, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. The iconic skyline of Manhattan glittered in the background, the polished desk gleaming under studio lights. But the chair was empty, and the audience seats were dark. "When was this taken?" Fallon asked, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. Jungkook didn't look away from the screen. "Yesterday," he replied. "They haven't filled your spot. They're keeping it empty. I think they're waiting." Fallon's hands clenched into fists. "Waiting for what?" he whispered. Jungkook turned to him, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "For you to be found," he said. "Or for you to be forgotten." The words hung heavy in the air, and Fallon felt something twist in his gut. He looked back at the screen, his gaze hardening. "Then we won't let them forget," he replied, voice firm. Lana appeared at his side, a bundle of cables and a sleek headset cradled in her hands. "It's time," she said, her voice smooth and steady. She handed him the equipment, nodding for him to follow. "We've only got a small window. Once we breach the feed, they'll scramble everything to try and shut us down. You'll have maybe 5 minutes, if we're lucky." Fallon took the headset, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface. It felt heavier than it should, like it was weighted with expectation. He looked back up at Lana, his eyes blazing with determination. "5 minutes is all I need," he replied. Jungkook smiled, just a flicker of pride flashing across his face. "You ready to do this?" he asked, his voice low. Fallon nodded, slipping the headset on and adjusting the microphone. "More than I've ever been," he replied. Kira waved him over to a small corner of the room where a camera had been set up, wires trailing from it to a bank of monitors that buzzed and hummed with energy. "Sit," she instructed, nodding towards the chair positioned in front of the camera. Fallon did as he was told, his hands settling on the armrests as he adjusted himself. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing a harsh beam directly onto his face. He blinked against the glare, squinting up at Kira. "I guess this is my good side," he quipped nervously. Kira didn't smile. She merely adjusted the lens, her eyes focused and calculating. "We're patching you in through an old analog bypass," she explained. "It's how pirate radio used to work. We can override the digital firewall. Just for a few minutes. After that, we're dark." Fallon swallowed hard, nodding. "Got it," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. He glanced up at the monitor, watching as his own face flickered onto the screen. The image was grainy, slightly distorted, but clear enough. Jungkook stepped into view, handing him a small black device. "This is your kill switch," he said. "If things go sideways, press it. It'll send a surge that will fry their tracking lines. But you only get one shot, so make it count." Fallon took the device, his fingers closing around it. "And if I don't press it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jungkook's expression hardened. "Then they find you," he replied simply. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling like dust. Lana stepped forward, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "This is it," she said, her voice carrying an edge of finality. "Once you start, there's no going back. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Fallon met her gaze, his heart pounding but his resolve unyielding. "I've been ready since the moment they tried to erase me," he replied. Lana smiled, a flash of something fierce and unyielding. "Then let's wake them up," she said, and with a nod to Kira, the monitors flared to life, the lights in the room dimming as the signal scrambled and the feed began to patch through. Fallon took a deep breath, his hands gripping the armrests as the countdown began. He could hear the static crackling through the headset, the buzz of frequencies shifting and colliding. He closed his eyes, steeling himself. Going live in 5, 4, 3, 2. The screen flickered, and Fallon opened his eyes to find himself staring back at the world. His own face broadcasted across millions of televisions, streaming to devices, cutting through news feeds. He watched as the signal cascaded through social media platforms, hijacking major broadcasts and live feeds. His face was everywhere. He took a deep breath, leaning forward. "Hello," he began, his voice steady and resolute. "If you're seeing this, then that means they haven't stopped us. Yet." The room behind the camera was silent, the only sound the steady hum of machinery and the soft clicks of keyboards. Fallon pressed on. "My name is Jimmy Fallon," he continued, "and I was erased. Not figuratively, not symbolically, literally. My name, my history, my career, wiped from existence because I saw too much. Because I woke up." The monitors flickered, security feeds showing chaos erupting in newsrooms, government offices scrambling to shut down the transmission. Fallon didn't stop. He leaned closer, his eyes burning with conviction. "You've been lied to," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Everything you see, everything you hear, it's a script, a narrative controlled by those who decide what you think, what you feel, what you believe." He watched as the numbers on the monitor spiked, millions of views, then tens of millions, a ripple effect cascading across the digital landscape. Fallon leaned back, his hands steady on the armrests. "They're going to try and stop this," he continued. "They're going to tell you I'm crazy, that I've lost my mind. But I haven't. I've woken up. And now, I'm waking you up too." Kira's voice crackled through his earpiece. "They're coming," she whispered. "We've got about 30 seconds. Fallon's heart pounded, adrenaline flooding his veins. He leaned in one last time, eyes blazing with defiance. "Don't go back to sleep," he said. "Don't let them blind you. Look around. Ask questions. Wake up." The screen flickered, the static crackling. Fallon's eyes narrowed. "We are the others," he whispered. "And we are just getting started." The screen blinked to black. Silence flooded the room, thick and unyielding. Fallon pulled off the headset, his hands shaking. He looked around at the others, Jungkook, Lana, Kira. All of them staring back at him with something like pride. Lana stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You did it," she said, her voice threaded with disbelief. "You actually did it." Jungkook smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "You just woke up the world," he said, his voice filled with awe. Fallon took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he had just done settle into his bones. He looked around the room, at the monitors coming back to life, the chaos spreading like wildfire across the screens. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly awake.